Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable discussion on fundraising for organizations with a global audience. I'm Adrienne Hall, Head of Chaplain York's Africa Division. We've set up Chaplain York's roundtables to create opportunities for professionals whose role it is to engage with international donor interest in their cause. I facilitate the roundtables looking at this theme through an African lens. COVID has, of course, challenged the resilience of all of us in responding to new financial demands, while we continue to raise support for our current programs. Understanding and learning from colleagues through the exchange of perspectives and experiences at the heart of our current conversations. I want to reassure you that Chatham House rules apply. So what happens in the roundtable stays in the roundtables. And so please don't hesitate to ask questions, share your story, and any challenges you might be currently experiencing and want to seek advice on. We kick off today's discussion with Sarah Roberts, who is Development Director of New Nexus Energy, and Penny Mbabazi Atuhaire, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at New Nexus Energy in Uganda. They will lead on today's discussion of major gifts. We then move to Russell Ali, who is now Senior Director of Institutional Advancement at the University of Free State, who will be looking at the challenges facing African-based organizations in the global donor market. Colin Haberton will be joining us later in the session and discussing how organizations. Please raise your hands in the chat if you'd like to ask a question after each presentation and in the plenary towards the end of the call. Sarah and Penny, if I might hand over to you to introduce yourselves in more detail and to kick off our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Adrienne. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and hopefully everyone can see this. Can someone just give me a thumbs up that you can see the first slide? Thanks, Adrienne. Great. So I'm going to kick off by saying thank you to Adrienne and to Chaplain York for this opportunity to talk about fundraising for organizations with a global audience with a specific focus on Africa. As Adrienne mentioned, I'm the Development Director for New Energy Nexus, which is a global organization that has a chapter in Uganda, where Penny is joining from, and Penny will introduce herself shortly. But I've also worked with a number of other inspiring organizations around the world that also, in some form or another, have a presence in Africa. I'm going to hand over just to Penny to introduce herself as well.
Thank you, Sarah. First of all, I'm also very happy to be part of this roundtable discussion that is, looking at the good practices in fundraising for organizations with a global audience. As you've already all, heard from Sarah, and my name is Penny Mbabazi Atuhaire, and I work with New Energy Nexus Uganda, which is a chapter of the bigger mother organization, New Energy Nexus, that is based in the US. I work as a director of strategic partnerships, and we are based here in Kampala, Uganda. We are basically a social enterprise that supports community-based organizations to start and run successful clean energy enterprises in different rural areas across Uganda. Professionally, I come from quite a diverse background. I started my career in community development and engagements. And then later I moved to the human rights space, where I worked with different organizations that are based in Uganda. Specifically, I was championing research and advocacy initiatives, both at the national and international level. And it's just 2.5 years ago, again, I made another career shift and joined the clean energy space to mainly fundraise and manage donor relations. And all this has happened within a space of 15 years of working experience. Thank you.
Thanks, Penny. I'm going to move to the next slide, and I know that we've got people from universities, people from the UK, people from different places around the world. I'm just going to turn my video on. My video can't go on, that's okay. Who may be very experienced in major gift and foundation fundraising. Today, Penny and I are briefly going to talk about what is normally seen as the 7 stages of successful major gift fundraising, which is research and qualify, cultivate, steward, solicit, thank, and ask and thank. I like to keep it really simple, and we're just going to cover 4 key stages of successful fundraising, which is finding donors, meeting donors, asking donors, and keeping donors. We're going to keep it short today. We're hopefully going to be finished in the next 10 minutes so that other presenters can speak. So the first resource and area I'd like to talk is, how do you find donors? Are you an organization with a project in Africa, but a head office in an international market? Are you an organization with a head office in Africa, but looking for international donors? Have you done your due diligence? Are you a registered charity in Africa? Are you a registered charity internationally? Are you fiscally sponsored? All these background due diligence information is pretty key. But for me, the first and most important place to try and find donors is actually working within your warmest networks, which is your board, your staff, your partners, and your existing donors. Your existing donors can make some really warm and good introductions for you. However, there's also some really useful external lists that you can research. For example, Funds for NGO sends a daily email on every single global funding opportunity that's out there. You can filter on Africa, for example, as a filter in receiving that. I've also put a link to the European Foundation Centre, which has a list of hundreds and hundreds of international funders. There's African Development Fund. I focus mostly on climate philanthropy. So there's a new foundation in Africa. It's about a year old, called the African Climate Foundation. And I've also put a link to a really good article which covers a number of different US and international lists that you can subscribe to or sign up to identify your donors. So first step, finding your donors. Then what you want to do is really compile your research and really prioritize those donors. There's 2 acronyms, CIA, Connection, Interest and Ability to Give, or ABC. It's the same thing, access to the donor, belief in your cause, or the capacity to give. Try as much as possible when you're doing your initial research and finding donors to put them in a database instead of an Excel spreadsheet, although I know we all end up working with Excel spreadsheets. Getting your data right in the first place is critical for ongoing success. So that's just the first step, and I will now hand over to Penny to talk about the second stage in successful major gift and foundation fundraising, which is meeting your donors. And just quickly, we are focusing, when I'm talking from a philanthropic background, from high net worth individuals and from family foundations or private foundations or corporate foundations, less so from a government fundraising perspective, although Penny does have experience in that.
Thank you, Sarah. So the next step is meeting donors. This is where you get to know your prospects through research. And this initial stage is basically all about relationship building. And one of the important things to keep at the back of your mind is that building deep and long-lasting relationships when you're looking out for potential donors and you're looking out for prospects is to know that these relationships take time to build. So it's a huge investment that you have to prepare for and be ready to invest in it in terms of time, in terms of resources. And then once you have identified who your potential donors are, then you reach out to them. This process usually starts with the simple steps like, setting up an in-person meetings, getting on the call, or maybe in this case of the COVID pandemic, Zoom usually comes in more handy. And this is a stage where the actual communication starts. And one of the important things to always remember is that building a relationship should not only be between two individuals, but it should be between an individual and an organization. So your team has to be involved at some point in this relationship. For example, in my case, I always prefer to start the initial cultivation steps alone. And then once I have gained a good rapport and good understanding of the prospect, then that's when I get the rest of the team to get involved. And I have found this very helpful because the team members usually add an invaluable insights from different angles of our program than I would certainly would if I was in that meeting alone. So this practice helps to build trust and confidence of the potential donor about your organization, its abilities, and what it can do. It basically demonstrates the good practice of working as a team, and every prospect would want to see that. Then before you get on to the meeting with your team, you need to prepare thoroughly well. Here, my colleague Sarah has introduced me to a very good practice that we should always develop a meeting strategy document before having a meeting with a prospect. And this meeting strategy document basically entails the objectives of the meeting, contacts of who is attending the meeting agenda, the background of the previous communications that you have engaged with the prospects. This is very important because it helps to provide context of what the meeting is about. And then more importantly, as a team, you think through the questions that you would want to ask the prospect during this meeting. All this must be carefully thought through in order to have a good engagement. And in the next, Sarah, if you could help me to go to the next slide. Asking donors. Yes. Asking donors, this is where now you need to make a big ask. And you need to have, here you need to have a good level of where you feel, have reached a good level where you feel your potential donor, where you feel you know your potential donor very well and your organizations before asking. Here you ought to have done some very good background research on what their core mission is, what they fund, what they do not fund, the size of the grant, so that you know exactly what to ask for. And one of the good practices I have learned over time is that when you are in a meeting, when this is happening, you should always give the donor enough time to talk about what interests them and what in respect to what they would like to fund and the support they would like to give you. So for example, instead of inserting yourself over time in the conversation, it's always important to make a point to allow the dialogue to flow between what the donor can do to your organization and how your organization can effectively utilize the resources that they would be willing to give. This is also a very important aspect as you're making and as you're planning and preparing to make a big, to make a big ask. And then the other one is the preparation. Here you need to practice the pitch in advance and then practice it thoroughly well. When presenting your pitch, usually it's important that you be genuine, direct, and specific. This is another point that should be a standard practice whenever you ask for a donation, because being direct and specific not only shows that you are interested in a prospect or a donor's contribution to your cause, but it also demonstrates that you have also invested some good time, some good resources in the cause that you would like them to support. Because most people don't want to give to organizations that give half-hearted attention. And so when you're able to prepare your pitch very well, and you show that you have invested and you have interest in the cause that you'd want the donors to support, this makes a huge difference. Thank you for listening, and over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Penny. So finally, we're just briefly going to talk about keeping donors. And once you have successfully secured a gift, and maybe you've got a donor that's based overseas and you're based in Africa, how do you, really engage with them and keep your donors? And again, in the presentation, there's links. There's an article to really the importance of thanking that I wrote about a donor many years ago who ended up starting off as a $10,000 donor and turning into a $50,000 a month donor and making additional grants of $1 million, which was incredible. And it was all about really keeping that relationship going and not just taking for granted that you've secured a gift, but really engaging with that donor in a creative way. So I was lucky enough to be working for an organization that had ships, and he had a yacht, and he was interested in our oceans and climate change. So, we got him on board the ship. We named a small inflatable after him. We got all the crew on the ship to hold up little letters that read out "thank you" to, and spelt his name out to the donor, printed it as a photo, and made sure that was in his study, which he got to see every day to remind him of his incredible generosity, which was amazing. So how can you engage donors when they may not be in your own country? Don't underestimate the power of a little handwritten note or putting something in the post, your impact reports, sharing evaluations on your program, doing really good donor reporting, and make sure you're reporting, as the grant agreement says, on time, with really demonstrating the impact that they've enabled your organization to make. And it's often easy to get that first grant, but really securing the second grant or multi-year funding is the harder step, and that is all about engaging with your donor. So if you know that your executive director or someone from your board may be traveling to where your donor lives internationally, or if you have an opportunity for a Zoom call, we do lots of events online now. I organize regular events that are now Zoom events, and anyone from around the world can call in. So they're just a few little tips. We don't have too much time today, and we'd love really to hear from you all about your challenges and questions, but I will hand it back over to Adrienne to facilitate. We can't hear you.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Penny. Are you able to turn your cameras on? Just
no,
as a while we're taking questions.
I'll stop screen sharing, and I think we might be able to then.
Great.
But it's saying,
great.
For some reason, it's not letting us turn our videos on.
Oh, perhaps Helen at events can have a look at that. The host can look at that. Yeah.
Yes. Great.
Oh, great. There you are. That was hugely interesting. Thank you so much. Do people in the group have questions or want to share any stories with us? And if you do, would you turn your camera on, please? No questions? Okay. Russell, perhaps we could go over to you and move to the plenary. We can perhaps have discussion of the whole concept later in the plenary.
Hi. Good morning and good afternoon. And those of you, I don't have anybody's in Australia or in New Zealand. It's probably good evening or all these time differences. So, I mean, we all speak about this global pandemic and this invisible virus that has had such a wide-ranging impact, for the most part, devastating. But I think it's also taught us a lot of new and interesting things that we probably have intuitively felt or believed. And that's it's made the world much smaller, and it's also made the world much bigger. I mean, that's the paradox, I suppose. Smaller in the sense that is that the virus knows no boundaries, doesn't know borders, doesn't know any continents. And we saw how very quickly it spread, and how it has changed the world. There's a very nice, I think it's a West African saying, that if you think that you're too small to make a difference, spend a night in a room full of mosquitoes. So yes, so it's made the world much smaller in one sense, but it's also made the world much bigger in the sense that we seem to be so much more removed now. We particularly us and in the developing world and the African continent, is philanthropy, particularly international philanthropy, is it going to bypass us now? Is it going to be preoccupied with what's happening in its own countries, their own challenges, their own civil society? We saw the most extreme version of this for 4 years in the United States under this doctrine of America First. But we've seen other variations of that as well. Now, why I'm giving this sort of background or this context is that philanthropy or fundraising, resource mobilization, never takes place in a vacuum. It always takes place in a context, which is what makes it so dynamic. It's a living thing. It changes and shifts. And for us, I think there's a real challenge to understand how the world is changing and what impacts potentially this will have with the kind of relationships that we have with grant makers or funders or foundations. And one of the self-evident things is that it's not business as usual. Okay, so we say that quite glibly, but that actually is the reality. It's not business as usual. So what has changed, and how do we approach from an African perspective a global audience, or how do we conduct our international fundraising? I think the first important thing, and something that both Sarah and Penny spoke to implicitly, and that's about the relationships, because we all say that fundraising is fundamentally about relationship building, and so the first really important thing is to ensure that whatever relationships you have already established in the past, is that you that those relationships have to be stewarded in a very, very conscientious and a very intentional way. And so it's very important to keep the lines of communication open, and not just about the successes, but also about the challenges. But it's also important that the communication is not just from your side, but it's also for you to understand from the perspective of your donors what's changing on their side. And so you should be probing and you should be asking your donors, the donors that you have historic relationships with, is how they see the world now. What has changed for them? What has shifted? What is important for them now? What's less important? So that dialogue is quite critical. So the first, as I said, is that it's often a tendency to, when things sort of shift and change, is that we kind of start looking outside of ourselves. That does come, but I think we first have to look at terms of what exists and what relationships there are, and we have to ensure that those relationships are nurtured, and we need to be aware of the fact that these relationships are going to shift and change, and we have to be prepared for those shifts and changes. The second important thing, of course, is that I said you first have to ensure that existing relationships, that you have to secure those. I think it was the third or the fourth point in Sarah's sort of presentation about keeping them, but obviously keeping them, that context shifts and changes, and we see in that now. The second, I suppose, very important thing is going back to the first. So I'm not dealing with these things as if there's a hierarchy, because all these things are important. They interact. Sometimes you do the first stage and you do the fourth stage, and then so it's a guide. Always see what we do in philanthropy as a guide. There's an art to it and a science to it, and we mustn't straitjacket ourselves. The other thing that's really critical is the prospect research now, and that's in some ways that's probably even more important now in this new era, this new world that we're moving into, because every foundation is actually shifting and changing. If you look at all of the big foundations, you'll see that they're writing different things, they're approaching things differently, asking different questions, and you need to get on top of that. You need to understand what it is that they are changing, what the trajectories of these changes. And then you have to decide for yourself whether those changes also, whether they fit in, are they aligned to where you want to go as an organization, or what your priorities are. So integrity is going to be so critical, because it's so easy for us in these sort of desperate times to move away from our own missions, visions, and chase the funding, as opposed to staying true to what our visions and missions are, and adapting, but not necessarily just going where we think we're going to get the money from. So we need to understand what these organizations are doing, and we have to see whether there is alignment between what we want to do and what they are, and the kinds of issues that they are focusing on. And I'll conclude by saying, let's not forget that it's even more important for us to turn to philanthropy in our own country and in our own continent as well during this period. And that's really about us taking responsibility for our challenges. And so don't underestimate the power of indigenous or local or community philanthropy, and find exciting and novel ways to engage with those possibilities. Thanks, Adrian.
Russell, thanks so much. And I think your point about having the courage to stay authentic, which is really important, and avoiding mission drift and opportunistic chasing opportunities which may not align completely with who you are and what you want to do is such an important point. Suzanne has asked a very interesting question, but I see Colin Haberton has joined us, and I'd like to move to Colin, and then perhaps we can answer and have discussions about questions after Colin has finished his discussions. Welcome, Colin.
Hi, Adrian. How are you? Hello, everyone.
Fine, thanks, Colin. How are you?
Yeah, very good. As chilly as KwaZulu-Natal gets, which is not as bad as most places, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, but it's lovely to be with you this afternoon and great to be part of this conversation. Thanks for the invitation, Adrian.
Pleasure, Colin. Colin, if you just, you've actually arrived timelessly. Russell has concluded his discussion, and I thought what we would do is I think he raised some interesting points which people might connect with what you are going to talk about, and then we can perhaps have discussions and further questions at the plenary. So if you want to just give a brief introduction about yourself and your experience in Africa and internationally, and then go on to your talk.
Sure, yes. Thanks, Adrian. So to those of you that are not familiar with me, as you can see, my name's Colin, and I have been involved in the philanthropic sector for approximately 15 years, and started off in one of the corporates I was working for at the time, Momentum, which I'm sure a lot of you know, and I was part of the Momentum Foundation Committee and played a part in some decisions around grant making, and that really caught my attention and curiosity really around the power of philanthropy, and really being very impressed with some of the excellent partners that we had at that particular point in time. That then developed, and I took a step out of corporate and started to get involved in enterprise development and a range of other initiatives. And one of the organizations that I got involved with, and this is now back in 2008, was a platform, an online donations platform known as Give and Gain, that some of you may be familiar with. That was halfway through its kind of development journey as we look at it at this point in time. It was founded in 2000 and I joined in 2008, and their intention was to want to see this particular technology serve the interests of organizations around the world. One of the challenges that South African causes had faced is that they were not able to receive international or foreign currency donations in an efficient manner at that particular point in time. And so Give and Gain filled that gap. It addressed that challenge. And over a period of 8 years that I was with them, it was a wonderful experience to see not only how technology can serve the interests of social and environmental causes, but I think more importantly, to see how the power of social media and the networks that causes had created through peer-to-peer marketing really took off for over the period of time that I was with them. Since then, I have moved on to a new series of initiatives. I think I would refer to them as that, where fundraising is not going to be cannot be achieved by online donations alone, as I'm sure a lot of you know, and being able to understand what are the dynamics of capital flows globally when it comes to supporting philanthropy. And for that, I want to share with you just a couple of 2 slides that are going to contextualize my talk and what I hope is going to lead to some conversation between us for the rest of the time that we have together. Just want to see and make sure that I can get this in front of us. Excuse me for one sec. All right. Let me know when you can see my screen. Okay. Is it coming through?
I can't see it yet, Colin.
Okay, let's try that again. Let's see, desktop share. Okay, I think that should be sharing.
Great.
Is that
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Now, there we go. Okay, cool. And what I've come to realize is that there are two realities that I think that fundraisers are facing, that organizations are facing globally. The one reality is one that I think we're all familiar with, is that as leaders of social causes, as organizations that are committed to building the sustainability of projects, programs around the world, we end up almost feeling like, we are the ones that are identifying where change is needed and where problems, whether they're social or environmental, need to be addressed. But where the money lies is merely just, we're picking up the crumbs under the table. And in many cases, that is the experience. And I found this particularly frustrating, being in a place where you can see the way the world is turning. You can see the onset of climate change. This is not something new. It's only the effects that we're starting to feel very personally now. If you look at how COVID has affected our lives, it is an example of a problem that has enormous social implications, and from a risk management perspective, something which very few organizations and individuals were able to to predict the impact of, but certainly we are all feeling it now. And the other reality that I want to start sharing is in the realm of looking not only at what donors there may or may not be, but to what extent we as organizations are being able to present ourselves as investable. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the way that the capital markets work, and this is sharing a diagram to show you the various elements of the investment value chain, the traditional financial markets have limited or no regard for environmental, social, or governance practices or social impact. What they are interested in, as I think we all are familiar with, is what is the financial return. But if you actually look at the way the world is turning, and it is turning incredibly quickly. When I first started looking at this space, understanding the frustrations of always, feeling like you're putting out a begging bowl when it comes to seeking donations and preparing grant proposals. You look at the amount of money that's associated with the philanthropic sector, which is certainly within the billions of pounds. If you look at that from an investment markets perspective, it is quantums of that type of capital flow. And 10 years ago, the idea of responsible investing was a new idea. In fact, in many ways, if you went to go and speak to asset managers, the likes of the Alan Greys, the Coronations, and so on, they may have become signatories to the principles for responsible investing, but that's about as far as it went. And what has taken place, particularly in the last 2 years, as climate change and the likes of COVID have started to affect investment portfolios, as the risks associated with environmental, social, and governance criteria have really started to have a material impact on capital, on wealth, there is a far greater appreciation from those decision makers for what these problems are and the risks that they pose, and if they are not addressed, the impact that they have on financial returns. And so what has transpired is that the segmentation within the investment value chain is now, yes, there are still traditional investors and investments where whatever the actual risks associated for it, as long as the financial return is maximized, that is where capital and the investors behind it will go. But there are increasing amounts of individuals and institutions that are looking for responsible, sustainable, and impact-driven investments. And here, that balance in this diagram is starting to shift dramatically. And in terms of the brief that Adrian and I chatted about coming into this discussion, the question was, you know, what does your brand, what does a brand of a non-profit organization, of a social cause, an environmental cause, a social enterprise, what is it, what does the type of brand need to be? How is it going to leverage itself in terms of being able to ensure its sustainability? The question I want to pose to you is, do you understand, can you measure, and can you present the impact that you are making in relation to environmental, social, and governance risks? Because when it comes to your investment decision makers, when it comes to the companies that have corporate social investment or corporate social responsibility budgets, when it comes to brands that are looking for partnerships, they are being held accountable by their stakeholders in order to make a difference in the environment, for their customers, in society. And the question, I believe, the opportunity, I believe, that sits in front of organizations and decision makers and fundraisers is, number one, do you understand this language? Number two, are you able to measure and manage your impact? And are you as a brand, as an organization, able to not only declare, but demonstrate your relevance going to be facing into the future with the type of uncertainties around the environment and society brought that lie ahead when you think about, you know, the implications of the next format of COVID, or what the implications of climate change are going to be on the people that we serve. So that is really the context that I wanted to share with you. And to look at that, look at branding, look at fundraising from an impact first perspective. I don't think there's an expectation for all organizations to suddenly become investable in terms of what financial returns are going to be offered. But what are the social and environmental returns that you can deliver and demonstrate? I believe that is the challenge that non-profit organizations, that charities, that social enterprises are going to have to stand to in the years to come.
Colin, thank you so much. That was hugely inspiring for the whole context, quite daunting, I think, because I think what you're saying is that in the same way as people who have capital are shifting, that non-profits have to shift themselves and be agile, basically. Right. Have demonstrate agility, which I think in a way COVID has prepared a lot of us for, because it was the black swan. It came out of nowhere. And I think agility has been a challenge, and something that a lot of organizations have had to demonstrate in how they reorganize themselves around COVID. But I think as we watch billionaires shooting themselves off into space, are they leaving us, or are they going to invest in us? Are they planning to abandon us and find homes on Mars, or are they planning to actually reinvest some of that wealth in addressing the problems that you have so clearly articulated?
Yeah.
Russell, I wondered if you wanted to come in and comment from your experience, particularly on working within universities, which can turn as quickly as the Titanic, really, and how universities could respond, and other nonprofits as well, from your perspective.
Sure. I just wanted to sort of pick up first on language, and I don't want to. It's not about semantics necessarily, because I think that the way in which the way in which the language so far has been used is very positive. But I've had this discussion a few times with calling ourselves, non-profit organizations, and I think what it does is convey is that we're not businesses, and that's important. But it doesn't. To some extent, it detracts also, because we do make profit, but it's social profit. You know, I don't think that profit is the preserve of business. And so I like to want to speak about us more as social profit organizations. And Colin was actually saying that to, you know, all intents and purposes, which is our main brand, as it were, is that we are social profit organizations. So yes, I mean, as I said, I don't want to get, you know, caught up in the you know, non-profit, NGO, that kind of sort of terminology. It's more around the sort of sentiment. But I think the more that we brand ourselves, the more we position ourselves as social profit, you know, organizations or public benefit organizations, I think it kind of helps to position us a bit differently. As opposed, you know, I've maybe because I'm, you know, as you know, Adrian, one of the things that we South Africans railed against for many years was this non-label that we were given. You know, you were non-whites. You know, you kind of a non-person, and so I've always had a kind of sort of reaction to this idea of non-profit. But
interesting point. Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to belabor that point. I've kind of made that point. I think that a lot of, you know, one of the in any, particularly in communities like in developing communities, and it's not the preserve of developing communities, also in advanced countries, the USA, UK. Often it's the non-profit organizations that are the kind of last defense, as it were, for the most vulnerable. In terms of service provision, in terms of advocacy, sometimes being the proverbial canary in the mine. You know, they sound the alarm when things are at risk. And what is happening during this period now, what COVID has actually done is that the very last line of defense itself is in an extremely fragile and vulnerable place. And I think that has to be quite important in our messaging now, is that if we are going to rebuild, if we are going to have the social cohesion that is so critical for us sort of moving forward, that if we don't rebuild that last line of defense, then even those communities that we're trying to reach are going to be much worse off. And I think those are the kinds of messaging that I think we need to build into as we rebrand ourselves really in this COVID and post-COVID world.
Thanks, Russell. I mean, I think, you know, what's happened in South Africa recently, where you have a 70% unemployment rate, and the tinderbox it creates, is a wake-up call for, you know, for societies that are structured in that way globally. And it's when you marginalize people, and you know, as Colin said, the kinds of things that have happened in South Africa is a huge threat to capital, So and civil society organizations and as Colin says, for purpose organizations. I love that, Colin, in the chat. It really underlines the importance of the impact that we can make and have to make if we are going to actually, you know, survive beyond 50 years, I would suggest. If I'd like to ask Sarah and Penny what their thoughts are, and other people on the call.
Well, I'll just jump in and talk to what Colin was saying. I think it's absolutely critical right now that we as civil society take back a little bit of power. And that first slide, you know, understanding the impact we make is really critical. But we also as civil society really need to hit home the urgency of the challenges that we are facing. I've worked in the climate movement for 30 years. I started in 1998 and we had 30 years to address catastrophic climate change. And markets are shifting and entrepreneurship is happening and new ideas are scaling. And I feel very privileged to be able to work for New Energy Nexus, which is an organization that helps clean energy entrepreneurs succeed. And it really is focused on what does that financial market look at in terms of, you know, what shifts, what creates social change? And yes, funding flows do that. We know that clean energy is a lot cheaper than dirty fossil fuels. How do we now leapfrog, you know, dirty diesel generators in Nigeria, for example, and bring in clean energy solutions? Technology is evolving quickly. So we, Penny and I at New Energy Nexus, we do quite a lot of work in terms of really quantifying what are the greenhouse gas emissions that we're saving, the number of women that we're employing, the number of jobs that we're creating as markets shift, as you see that clean energy becomes cheaper. But I still think there's still, you know, you get so excited about a $50,000 grant and there's major foundations and funders and institutions and governments with a lot of money that they're sitting on in endowments that is not shifting faster. And we're in the defining decade when it comes to climate change. So I think it is really important to be speaking in that space of impact philanthropy, and also your organization as a structure and that long-term sustainability. So social enterprises where there's a for-profit side of the business, and how do you build that in, and how do you demonstrate that you can actually work for purpose and create employment and financial opportunities as well. So many organizations will have, so New Energy Nexus, for example, has a 501c3 not-for-profit, but it has a 501c4 and it has 3 entities. And some of these entities can be used for investors to invest in companies. Now that's just one organization. And I know in this room, you know, there's people coming from different perspectives. And I also work with the Resilience Institute, for example, which works with Indigenous communities on climate adaptation. So education and things become important. And I don't know how you quantify impact that way. So I think that's a really interesting discussion and I could go on, but I won't. I'd love to hear more about other people in the room and what organizations are they working for? What challenges do they face in fundraising from the African continent?
I think Sylvie wants to come in here, Sarah. Thank you so much, Sylvie Barr.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Sylvie.
Good afternoon. Oops, sorry. I've got to take this and shift it down. And then...
You better answer that it could be a funder.
Well, actually, not in the, you know, the fundraising world per se. I currently work with Chapel and York in the on their brand and their marketing, actually. So being part of these roundtables is a great way for me to learn about your challenges and your opportunities, and also understanding really the whole, you know, universe. But my background has been in marketing and in branding, for as long as I can remember. The thing that's interesting maybe about my experience is that I started in blue chip companies, and then I moved into what at the time was called ethical companies. So I was the head of marketing at Cafe Direct, which was in the early year 2000, the pioneer of fair trade in the UK. So I've got experience with working with coffee farmers and tea farmers around the world. Fond memories of meeting the farmers, coming and explaining the story from their perspective when they came to the UK. Also visiting. I didn't have the chance. I've got a very good friend who, well, he used to be, I don't know if he's still, but he used to be the lead for the oldest coffee cooperative in Africa. So it's all about, and what I was saying in the chat, it's this aspect of you know, and I think that's where we're coming on to now. It's not about per se what making profit. It's about what you do with the profit, and I agree with Russell about all these boxing in and these labels that we put. Oh, I'm an ethical company, I'm a social enterprise, I am, ultimately things are shifting, and I think the notion of impact assessment is not new. After I did Cafe Direct, I moved to the charity world per se. So working for a large charity in the UK, the Royal National Institute of Blind People. And these guys were operating pretty much like, a big blue chip, because they were, working with huge amount of grants that they got from the government to deliver services. They had to be as professional as, a marketing team in a private company to raise, funds to serve their beneficiaries. So the notion of impact assessment has been, for a number of charities, especially the one with high visibility, quite, there for a long time. And that's been something that they grappled with a lot, because ultimately a charity at its core is here to serve their beneficiaries, and they just want to spend their time doing that and not sort of finding ways to, sort of analyze and quantify and report. But the world, is moving, and people want to know what, people are doing with their money, and accountability is raising. But the notion of triple bottom line was already there when, I was at Cafe Direct. So, financial return, social return, and environmental return is something that I've heard and I've seen being discussed for a long time. I think for me, the big difference maybe that has occurred over the past couple of years, as Colin was mentioning, is that it's becoming more real, in the sense that the financial world is gradually waking up to the fact that if nothing is done meaningfully on these things, there's not going to be any financial return going forward, because the planet's just not gonna, carry on sustaining its inhabitants, and we're just gonna all implode in a very, sort of dramatic way.
Yeah.
But it's that point that, like for the past 20 years, there's been lots of CSR reports being, published by big corps and wanting to demonstrate that, we are environmentally friendly, and that was for me far more lip service story that, was really to sort of stroke the shareholders in the right, sort of the right direction. But now I think the shift is that it's gonna have to become real.
Sylvie, thank you.
Sorry.
No, not at all, not at all. I think it's we're fortunately running out of time, which is very sad. There's just one question that Suzanne asked, which was really how many people do you need in a team to address these kinds of things? And my experience is, when you're inside an organization, getting organizations to actually measure themselves in the way that Colin has suggested is very challenging, and also getting them to invest in this particular area, providing you with the correct resources and the number of people that you need to engage what the goals that they have set is as challenging. I'm afraid I'm going to have to shut off now, as it's 1 o'clock. But I think, Suzanne, people answered your question in detail in the chat. I want to thank Colin. I want to thank Russell, Sarah, and Penny. Thank you so much, and to everybody for joining us. And I hope you found it as valuable, enjoyable as I have. It's certainly been an eye opener for me as well. Thank you. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. And thanks, Adrian, for
Pleasure. Thank you.
participating. Thanks, everyone. Nice meeting
Thanks,
everyone.
Adrian.
Hope to see you
Thanks,
again
everyone.
soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.